Bienvenidos to the Bronze Titan podcast on YouTube. I'm your host, Benjamin Ramos. I'm an independent journalist and a longtime Cuba solidarity activist based in New York City. And once a month, I'll be bringing you a podcast from the international movement to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba. Before we go on with the podcast, I just want to wish everyone un feliz año nuevo, a happy new year. I also want to recognize that this past Tuesday, January 28th, was the 172nd birthday of Jose Martí Perez, a very well-known Cuban revolutionary poet, essayist, journalist, revolutionary soldier. We stand on his shoulders. Jose Martí has been an inspirational figure for many of us. He blazed a trail that many of us walk when it comes towards fighting for freedom, justice, and liberation. So on today's podcast, we're going to be speaking with Cheryl Labash of the National Network on Cuba. We're going to be talking about Cuba's recent removal from the list of states that sponsor terrorism and its re-addition all within just a couple of days, almost felt like a couple of hours. So welcome to our podcast again, Cheryl.
Well, thank you so much, Benjamin. This podcast is such a contribution to the struggle. It's, reaching into the new genre of how to communicate. And it really is a weapon in our struggle to end the blockade. And thank you so much for doing it on a regular basis.
Oh, you're welcome, Cheryl. I'm just glad to have you back. As some of you might remember, our podcast is only a few months old. Cheryl was with us a few months back talking about what it means for Cuba to be on this list. And we've got Cheryl back because we've had an amazing victory and then an amazing turnaround. So Cheryl, just let's remind our listening audience, what does it mean for Cuba to be on the list of state sponsors of terrorism? What does that mean for the island?
Well, first of all, it's an arbitrary list. It's a political list. The U.S. government, the State Department will put a country on this list, and it automatically institutes, it's like economic sanctions on steroids. It becomes impossible to get any international commerce. Already there were restrictions on Cuba buying materials and selling materials internationally. But what this did is it made any international institution doubly, triply watchful on any kind of transaction that had any relationship to Cuba. It meant that they could not buy so many things. Even during the pandemic, they weren't. But when Cuba was put on the state sponsors of terrorism again on January 20th, immediately 30 banks cut their relations with Cuba. And, in our digital world, people, especially in large-scale commerce, you don't come with a bag of money. Usually it's all done commercially and trading between banks. So that, and another really significant thing that automatically goes into effect is if someone from one of the many countries that are not required to get visas to travel to the United States has traveled to Cuba in the past 10 years, they cannot use that method of getting a visa waiver. So what that means is, if somebody was thinking of bringing their kids to Disneyland, or if they had business in New York, or if they were like Helen Yaffe, who was an academic, a book publisher. Her work is about Cuba and she does it in Cuba. She was not able to get a visa waiver, one of these ESTA visa waivers. I think there's 40 countries that have this ability to travel to the United States, but if you've traveled to Cuba, you cannot use it. And that means you have to get in line for a visa. You have to pay more money. You have to go to the embassy. I mean, you have to go through this whole procedure, and then they don't have to give it to you. So, what that has done is really cut tourism from Europe. As a matter of fact, today I read an article that two airlines from Switzerland have cut their flights to Cuba. Um, so it really is a hardship with a country that gets most of its foreign capital from tourism.
Um, Cheryl, I think it's important that let's talk about why Cuba is on this list because can you answer how many acts of terrorism against the United States has Cuba engaged in?
None.
Okay.
Zero.
So, and how many acts of terrorism, let's say, to U.S. allies or around the world has Cuba engaged in?
None.
Okay. So, but Cuba is still on a state sponsors of terrorism list. Why do you think so?
Well, I think uh, I was listening to a video of Johanna Tablada, who is from the Foreign Ministry of Cuba, answering that same question. And what she said is they knew in in 4 months, if Cuba was not put back on the list, Cuba would be thriving again. The point is to asphyxiate, to suffocate, to destroy the lives of the Cuban people. One of the things I talk about a lot is the Mallory Rubata memo from April 6th, 1960. It has an anniversary this year. It's the 65th anniversary of this memo. And in it, now it was secret at the time, but in it, what they say is there is so much support for the revolution and what it's doing that there is no internal opposition. What we need to do is, as adroitly and inconspicuously as possible, create unemployment, hardship, lack of income for the Cuban people so that they will organize and rebel against their government. That memo, because it's been so long, has been declassified and available to the public, but it spells it out specifically what the intention is. And that has been the intention of the US government policy ever since then. And we've seen it time and time and time again. I've got some examples of that too, Ben. But we also saw when Obama in May of 2015, as part of this new way of relating to Cuba, of the United States government relating to Cuba, there was a tremendous economic burst of development in Cuba. People were doing so much better. There was the creativity of the Cuban people was unleashed. And quite honestly, I believe, along with Johanna Tablada, that the reason that they maintain Cuba on the list is that they know that that economy, if it's not strangled from outside, will grow, develop, and blossom. There are plenty of accomplishments that Cuba has made over the years that point to this, but we actually saw it in 2015, 2016, 2017. We saw movies being made in Cuba. We saw really a burgeoning of cruise ships, all kinds of tourism. It was really quite a time. But then when Cuba was put on the state sponsors of terrorism in the last days of the Trump administration, um, it really closed down. It really closed down, and it made it more difficult. Um, I want to I want to say also that the digital age that we live in has made it easier for the United States to identify ways that Cuba has gotten around this economic war. And they have also carried out a war on Venezuela to block oil shipments. Cuba's an island. They have to import anything that they cannot produce themselves. And oil is one of them. They produce a little bit of oil. They're transitioning to solar, but they can't operate their electricity, their hospitals, their transportation system without having oil. So at the same time that the United States began to normalize relations with Cuba, at the same time, they opened the door to strangling Venezuela and breaking that lifeline of oil.
And it makes sense when you see the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela and the whole development of the ALBA movement. Absolutely, in no way will developing nations be able to exist in this part of the world without the U.S. intervening in one way or another. I remember in some of our pre-interview talks, we've talked about how the Monroe Doctrine is coming back into effect. The U.S. government is trying to control everything that happens in this hemisphere. Every economy has to be under their control, every type of political decision. Cheryl, I always find it fascinating when the U.S. government is asked why is Cuba on this list. What is the U.S. government's response? What was happening with Cuba that they decided this needed to happen?
Well, it's really has nothing to do with what Cuba does or doesn't do. They do give excuses, however, and in fact, the new um, State Department representative Marco Rubio answered this question today. He said that Cuba supports FARC and the National Liberation Front of Colombia. Therefore, Cuba is a sponsor of terrorism, and that is why they're on the list. The excuses vary. First of all, what Marco Rubio said is a falsehood, complete, utter falsehood, because what Cuba did is it participated and helped to facilitate a peace agreement that stopped the internal war in Colombia that had gone on since 1948, when the progressive presidential candidate Gaitan was assassinated. Um, so Cuba was a good neighbor to help bring peace to Colombia, to start that process. Um, they helped to negotiate they gave a safe space for the negotiators from Colombia and from FARC, and then later from the ELN, to come together and work out some way of ending that war that's really devastated Colombia. So, the reason they're putting Cuba on the list is because they make peace. On the list because they're an example to the world in having a just society, a progressive society, a society that puts people first, that the needs of the people come before anything else, and the resources of the country are dedicated to providing for people. That means that you have, and it's guaranteed by the Constitution, you have free education. When you graduate from school, you have a job. what you have a right to health care, free health care. If you need, if your job is collecting garbage, for example, and you need a heart transplant, you get a free heart transplant. You don't have to do an online fundraiser to raise money to pay your doctor bills here, or become bankrupt, or um, go through any of that. These things are guaranteed by the government, and the government does everything it can to provide for whatever people need. It's more difficult, obviously, because the United States is trying to choke the economy to make a point and be able to say Cuba's a failed state. But it's not a failed state. There's a book written by somebody who was a real, he was arrested at the Bay of Pigs. He was, the Bay, or I have to remember that people, that there's a lot of people who've been born since 2000 that were born since 1961. The United States orchestrated an invasion of Cuba at what was called the Bay of Pigs. Cuba calls it Playa Girón. Um, it was defeated in 72 hours. The people came out to the beaches until the army could get there. The Fidel himself came out to organize the defense. And it was the first time that U.S. imperialism was defeated militarily. Now they did it. They didn't take any uh, credit for doing it. It wasn't done under a U.S. flag. It was all very hidden. They wanted to play like it was Cubans. They recruited Cubans and other people from Latin America to participate in this. And they were trying to set up a government or a U.S. inspired government in Cuba that could overturn the revolution and the gains of the revolution. Well, it was defeated, but that doesn't mean that the United States wouldn't try to do that again. And
Absolutely.
when you hear the current president talking so glowingly about Gaza, about Gaza has waterfront and it's got great weather, that's got so much, and we could do a lot with this. When I heard him say that, I thought, well, gee, he could be saying that about Cuba as well.
Well, definitely, Trump is going to have some serious plans for Latin America that are going to be very much imperialist and very much not freedom oriented in any way. I want to jump back to, though, Cheryl, you were talking so much about those peace accords, because again, so Cuba is on a list of state sponsors of terrorism, essentially because they were fighting for freedom and ending warfare. I believe I believe I had heard Norway was also involved in those peace talks. So is Norway also on that list of state sponsors of terrorism?
No, both Norway and Cuba were guarantors of that peace process. And no, of course, Norway was not. The other
In
thing that the U.S. Well, first of all, it's called state sponsor of terrorism, right? It doesn't say this place is undemocratic or this place has human rights violations. That's not part of the thing. This is state sponsor of terrorism. And even the Biden administration, at the last days of his days in office, took Cuba off the list. He certified, and to get off the list, the president or State Department has to certify that that country has not engaged in state sponsor of terrorism for the past 6 months. This is not like forever and ever. It's the past 6 months. And Biden certified that. If he had meant really to take Cuba off the list, he would have done it when he was first in office. But it was great that he did it nonetheless, because now we have another president saying that Cuba has no business being on the list. It's another thing that we can take when we're talking to people in our community, our elected officials, in our unions. It's another actual concrete document that we can show that Cuba should not be on this list. Um, it's going to be a fight, but it's an even bigger fight to end the blockade. And talking about the state sponsors of terrorism, we have to be aware that the push to get Cuba off the list was so strong, so wide, involved so many people. Really, this past year has been a real push on many different levels to get Cuba off the list. That there are people in Congress who are trying to make it a law that Cuba will perpetually be on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. It's called
Exactly. They're
Force
trying
Act.
to, the Force
Mhm.
Act, exactly. They're trying to codify this so that Cuba will never be able to be removed from this list, despite the amazing amount of support. And let's look at that, folks. Cheryl again represents the National Network on Cuba, which has a wonderful website, nnoc.org, where you
Mhm.
see there are just an amazing array of not proposals. I'm sorry. Not proposals, resolutions,
Resolutions.
resolutions from city governments all over the country. You have resolutions that have come from academic organizations, human rights organizations, famous activists, famous, entertainers. The movement has really been really big, Cheryl. I mean, the New York City right here, those of you from New York City, this city right here, New York, passed a resolution in 2024 calling for, an end to the blockade, but also the removal from this list. And Cheryl, just to gear our conversation, because I love how you were saying there's work that needs to be done. Let's get a little predictive. What is it that we need to do now? Now that we've had a victory for a couple of days, and then Trump did what he did on January 20th, which I think Cheryl and I have joked around that it's only been the inauguration just took place a week and a half ago, and it feels like he's been in office for years.
It's
That's what it
already
feels
been
like.
4 years.
It feels like it's already been 4 years, and it's only really been a week and a half, maybe a little bit over a week and 75. But what is it that we do now, Cheryl? How does the movement change? How does it stay the same? What do we do now?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I not only think, I think we have proof and facts that show that the people of the United States are not hostile to Cuba, and when they know about the blockade, are not for it. This includes people who are not supporters of the Cuban government, and people who are supporters, and people who are just justice loving. You know, Cuba has now 10 million people. It's about the same as Michigan, and about the same land mass, maybe a little bit less. It's a small country. I mean, it's big in relation to the Caribbean. So all our friends from the Caribbean say, don't say it's a small country. But in relation to the United States, you figure this is a developing country. It is a country that was colonized. It was a country that had um, centuries of slavery, that had that really in 1898 was virtually taken over by the United States. Um, and that the United States has wanted to take it over. Even before the revolution, they saw Cuba as part of the manifest destiny. And I think really what's happening too is we're going farther back than the Monroe Doctrine. That in fact now it's become uh, the manifest destiny that somehow the United States and its government have a right to rule over everyone. Um, so in 1898, they were taken over. Then they had, governments. They were forced to give up land for Guantanamo, and that's a big issue right now. The Trump administration says they're going to take 30,000 people who are deported and have them held in on the U.S. base in occupied Guantanamo. Um, Cuba does not want that base to be there. Has told the United States to close the base. It's not just the prison that's on the base. It is the base itself that is a violation of Cuba's sovereignty. And when all of this discussion about housing migrants in on the U.S. naval base there, we have to remember that that is not Cuba. It is occupied U.S. Territory there, and Cuba has a right to it. So we have to, in addition to saying no to the deportations and protecting our siblings, our neighbors who are facing this wave of deportation, that in addition to that, we should say no, no, no Guantanamo, U.S. out of Guantanamo completely.
So, Sarah, we're coming into a scary period of time. Again, all jokes aside, a week and a half. That's all it's been, and this 4 years of work is really going to be a lot. Um, I'm just wondering, what are your insights? What do you think? What is working and what needs to be done?
Well, number one is people need to go to Cuba. Um, we're aiming at 150 people to the International May Day Brigade. The National Network on Cuba is working with one of our member organizations, the Venceremos Brigade, to better coordinate and build large kind of work study brigades. The Venceremos Brigade is the oldest solidarity organization in the United States, solidarity with Cuba. Um, so they will be helping us to organize for the International May Day Brigade. That, of course, is around May Day, the International Workers' Holiday. And then they will also be going around July 26th, which is the Rebel Day, the day that Fidel Castro and the other revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks and started the process to build the revolution in Cuba. And then the other is it's the 65th anniversary of our partner in Cuba, the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the People. So they've been around since right after the revolution, building solidarity with all of the friends from around the world. So there will be delegations coming from the Venceremos Brigade and others for all of those. But right now, 150, we're looking for people who've never been to Cuba. We're going to have a real hard slog raising money to help people to go. But like I said, this is a work study. We learn about Cuba. We work alongside the Cuban people. Um, we help to rebuild the camp because it was hit by the last hurricane. Um, but there are many, many, many ways to go to Cuba now. It's not like back in the old days, in the days of Pastors for Peace, where we had to challenge at the border to go. Now you can get on a plane at a U.S. airport. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think that the blockade is over. Obama went to Cuba, so there is no problem. There is a problem. And that, for me, goes back to those words in the Mallory Rubottom memo, as adroitly and inconspicuously as possible. And that they're hiding their hand. They're telling these lies that somehow Cuba's a state sponsor of terrorism, that Cuba's a failed state, that Cuba, that there's chaos. I started talking about this guy who actually helped to build the right wing in Florida. He was one of the founders of the Cuban American National Foundation, which was in league with Reagan and the right wing. Um, he in 1995, they were saying, "Oh, the counter revolution is here. The people are rebelling against Fidel," and all that. That was the word in Miami. And his wife said to him, according to his words, "Well, why don't you go to Cuba? Go." Now, he had been born in Cuba. He had been captured at the Bay of Pigs. He was in prison in Cuba. He was repatriated to the United States. And then he got into this, he became a lawyer, but he got into this building this institution really against Cuba. He went to Cuba and it completely changed his mind. The name of his book is What I Learned About Cuba by Going to Cuba. He said, I went to Cuba and I saw people going about their lives. I go any place else in Latin America and you have armed guards everywhere. I didn't see any armed guards in Cuba. The kids were going to school, people were going to work. It was completely normal. And in fact, that is what people see if they go to Cuba now. It's a country that's struggling, but it's not struggling nearly as much as countries in Latin America that have not had a revolution.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. And Cheryl and I guess we're very open about our bias because Cheryl and I are both brigadistas. We both participated in the Venceremos Brigade. So I agree with Cheryl, folks. There's a lot of ways to go to Cuba now, and it starts there. It starts seeing for yourself. Get the Fox News element out of your perspective. Get the U.S. corporate media and imperialist media perspective out of your mind and go see Cuba and talk to people and ask them questions. Ask them, are people here ripped from their jobs and ripped off the street and disappear by secret police and all that? And people are like, no, that doesn't happen here. They talk about, what it's like to live their lives and that they're not, and of course, there's a lot of wonderful political analysis because the Cubans are right. They live under a blockade that's sponsored by the U.S. government. And there's that other thing, which is that Cuban people, in my opinion, of the years that I've been going to Cuba, they talk about the U.S. government and the U.S. people as two separate categories. They don't say, "Oh, you guys are the ones oppressing us." No, they say your government is doing things that probably you are not in favor of, because no one walks around thinking, I want to oppress people. Maybe some do, so most do not. And that's what I've always loved about Cuba, is that they know how to separate their friends from those from the government. The government doesn't represent people like you who come here to Cuba to see and to speak with us without fear. So Cheryl, I I'm thinking about what this future looks like. There's a conference coming up in March, because I always want people to leave here your first homework that Cheryl and I are giving you is go to Cuba, learn about the May Day Brigade, the Venceremos Brigade, Pastors for Peace, There are a lot of wonderful brigades. In fact, Cheryl has given you a little bit of my programming for the next couple of months because I'm going to have the Venceremos Brigade on. I'm going to have some folks from IFCO, Pastors for Peace, on to talk about this new era as well. There's a conference coming up in March that the NNOC, along with a lot of other Cuba-oriented organizations, are working on, and that'll be something very concrete for people to go to experience. Can you give us a little bit of a smidgen of what's happening in March?
Yeah. Um, every March, we have a tremendous opportunity because getting having actual Cubans to talk to from the island is not so easy. Um, People getting the visas, the U.S. has restricted visas for Cubans to come here. But in March, the United Nations has a whole program about the status of women. And there is always a delegation of women who come from Cuba to participate in that. And while they're here, they also participate in a conference that is built around the issues that deal with Cuba, the blockade, and a whole variety. It'll deal with travel and restrictions on travel. It'll deal with what we need to do, action plans. It'll be education. It'll also be virtual as well as in person. So if you're in the New York area, please go to uscubanormalization.org and put in your pre-registration. Plan to come to New York for it. At least part of the events are going to be in the Malcolm X Betty Shabazz Center. And this is Malcolm X's 100th anniversary of his birth. It's a very important year for our struggle here in the United States and internationally as well. So that is a wonderful site. It's a museum to Malcolm X as well as a venue. So part of the program will be there. There'll be a lot. There'll be reports from, there was just a conference in Cuba, and there was a large delegation from the United States about it ended up the 10 years of the decade of Afro descendants. So there was this fabulous program in Cuba. A lot of people from the United States were there. They're going to be participating in the conference. There'll be an opportunity to learn about it. And a lot, like the last time we had a conference, we had movies, we had all kinds of educational activity, workshops where people could talk and discuss issues, as well as plenary sessions. So please be there. But in
And
addition, go ahead.
I was also going to say, for those of you folks in the legal world, some of you who are lawyers, there's also going to be a delegation, I believe, from the National Union of Cuban Jurists as well. So we're hearing from the Federation of Cuban Women, and you'll be hearing folks from the Cuban legal system, which a lot of people love to. A lot of people have a lot to say about the Cuban legal system, and it's usually misinformation that they're parroting. Again, Fox News, imperialist news, but you'll be able to talk to and listen to Cuban jurists. You'll be able to hear Cuban lawyers, Cuban judges. You'll be able to hear from Cuban people about their legal system. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Well, since you brought that point up, for people who are, paralegals in law school, there is also a law for the people brigade coming up, and they're still getting applications. The NNOC Instagram, we republished their, I really wasn't prepared to raise this, but since you raised it, if you work in the legal realm, you are welcome to join that. And it's upcoming, I think, in March as well. Go to Cuba with young lawyers to become the defenders of the future. So yeah, and while usually the Cuban delegation is in New York for a couple of weeks. So the big event is generally the conference, but there are other meetings with activists and activist organizations that go on as well. So you may be a part of one of them that is going to be meeting with the Cubans on a smaller scale. And even at the conference, there's a lot of opportunity between sessions to talk to people. They're very approachable, very eager to talk to you. So please do come to the conference. But there's more that you can do. I'm glad that Benjamin asked that. This question of the Force Act, it was just introduced again. So it's been introduced before in a previous Congress, and all of these things have to be reintroduced. So it's been introduced, it's in the House, it's in the Foreign Relations Committee, and everybody's eyes are closing over as I'm talking about doing advocacy in Congress. We need to do education about what they're trying to do. Back in the 1990s, it used to be up until I think 1996 when Helms-Burton was passed. It really was up to the president, the relationship with Cuba. The president could end the blockade completely with a stroke of the pen. But in 1996, the law said that it took away the power of the president to change it. The president still can change many things, but the president cannot end the blockade anymore. So what they're attempting to do is little by little make every aspect of the blockade an unchangeable fact of law, where they have more opportunities to prevent us from exercising the political will. I believe that the people of the United States are not for this blockade. And we have worked to get these resolutions as a way of showing more than 60 million people. The United States only has 320 million people. We have enough resolutions to be able to say that 60 million people of this country are not for the blockade, are not for Cuba being on the SSOT. So there's a lot that can be done. There was with Congress, and we're going to be working out concrete goals and ways of plugging into doing that. If you want somebody to talk about the state sponsors of terrorism or to talk about Cuba, we can help you. The National Network on Cuba, write to us. We will help you. You want a speaker, you want a movie, you want help in any direction. We have friends, and there are young people from all across the country who will help you. Do an event, have a speaker. The National Single Payer Association for Single Payer Healthcare took a delegation to Cuba along with one of the National Network on Cuba members. They're doing a webinar on the 26th of February to talk about their trip to Cuba. So these are doctors and people who are in the healthcare realm. So it's possible. There are, for example, I just heard there are teachers from Chicago who are planning to go to Cuba. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get there or that you can participate. We have a list of members member organizations on our website. Find somebody in your area. If there's nobody in your area, we can help you be
And
that person.
And folks, we live in a digital world. Go to nnoc.org, nnoc.org, and look through the website. The Contact Us tab allows you to be able to subscribe to newsletters. That allows you to be able to see social media. So the NNOC and a lot of the amazing resources in just 10 seconds. The NNOC is made up of various organizations, individuals, institutions that do work around Cuba. So when Cheryl says there may be a Cuba committee in your own city, in your own state, look on the website and you will see that there are contacts for people all over the U.S. that are doing this type of work. So as we're wrapping up, I just want to go back to the conference. We New York heads are always pushing what happens here. And I know Ike Naheem would kill me if I don't give the exact details. The conference is the weekend of March 15th and 16th here in New York City. Though Cheryl is correct, it will also be virtual. So if you live in Michigan, you're in Louisiana, you're in California, you have the ability to participate in certain aspects of the conference. So we want everyone to go to uscubanormalization.org and register. Those of you that need the virtual information will get it via email. Those of you that are able to travel to New York, you'll know where we're going to be. You'll register and you'll be able to attend. So in terms of wrapping up, I love how we end on action. Cheryl is correct. There's legislative work that needs to be done. More resolutions need to be passed. In fact, if you're a part of a union, if you're part of the city, if you're a city council person somewhere in the United States and you're listening to this podcast and you've said, hey, my city council hasn't passed a resolution around Cuba. We need to do some educating around that. Then contact us in the NNOC. We have a whole toolkit that people can use for advocacy. If you're not a city council person, but you have relationships with people, this work has to happen on every level. Whether you're an educator, an activist, a musician, a poet, if you're an academic, we need everyone organizing on every level of civil society, because I agree with Cheryl. It's not just 60, it's probably a lot more than 60 million people that don't believe in the need for this blockade or the SSOT. At the United Nations every year, there's a vote, and over 180 some odd countries vote stating that this blockade is inhuman and illegal. The only two countries that support it are the US and the 51st state, Israel. So that's the reality of it. We're going to end on an activist note. One more time, give us some of that information, Cheryl. How do we contact the NNOC?
Go to our website, nnoc.org. Check it out, sign up there. You can write to us. We have an email address. It's nnocuba, nnocuba @gmail.com. And that goes to all the co-chairs. We try to act on what you're presenting. We have committees that are working on resolutions, on building the Mayday Brigade. We really need to do some fundraising. If you've got some ideas on that, please write to us and we'll get back to you on it. We need you. We need you to help end this injustice. What's being done to the Cuban people is an injustice, and we in the United States we are the ones who are closest to our government that is doing this in our name. We can change it. We can include it find out about all this history of Cuba. Find out about how they don't have to worry about being evicted from their homes because everybody owns their own home. Find out about the reality and how a lot of the things that we have to worry about, they don't have to worry about. We do want to make sure that they do not have to worry about having an economic war trained on them decade after decade. We want Cuba to live. And that's one of our slogans, Let Cuba Live. We're doing fundraising to help buy pacemakers because the company that makes the pacemakers can't sell to Cuba. They can sell to us. And so we raise money to buy pacemakers and send them to Cuba. We're part of the solution, along with the Cuban people's resilience, resistance, and basically standing up for saying, with all, for all, that all of the people have to be provided for and defended. Human dignity triumphs over all of the madness that we're facing.
I love it, Cheryl. Human dignity will triumph. So, mi gente, this is your January edition of the Bronze Titan podcast. Thank you so much to our sister Cheryl. I hope to have Cheryl on a third time and to talk a little bit about how this blockade is gone and how we're off of the SSOT. I'm hoping, Cheryl, that we'll be able to do a podcast based on all these amazing victories, that all of this work that we're going to be doing in the next year, 2, 3, 4 will result in. Thank you to the listening audience. Give me 10 seconds to do the usual YouTube plug. Please subscribe to this channel, like, share it, turn on the notifications so that you know when we post. We'll be posting once a month. My goal for this year is to have 12 podcasts, maybe 13, 14, 15. If there's any, chance I can get on extra, I would love to be on. So please join us next time in February. Again, many thanks to Cheryl Labash of the National Network on Cuba. Como siempre, Cuba sí, bloqueo no.